If you've been on the internet lately, or really anywhere in the wellness world, you've heard the message, eat more protein. And honestly, that message isn't wrong. Most Americans do not get enough protein in their daily diet. And that matters for your weight, your metabolism, and your overall health. But somewhere along the way, eat more protein became protein is magic and more is always better. And that's where science starts to push back. I'm Dr. Greg Oliver, and I'm giving you a warning about today's talk. It will get pretty sciencey. Don't get frustrated with some of the science terms, names, and actions. My goal is to get you to see that there is so much more to losing weight and getting healthy than just eating right and exercising. Our body is a complex chemistry machine that works best when we better understand what to feed it and how to operate it. Hopefully, after this video, you might gain just a bit more insight into how to do that. Today, we're going to do something that doesn't usually happen enough in popular health content. We're going to look at all three macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and talk about what your body actually does with each of them, how they're digested, how they're turned into energy, how many calories they carry, and most importantly, why balance isn't just a safe, boring recommendation, it's the biochemically correct recommendation. Macronutrients are the three categories of nutrients your body requires in large amounts, hence the term macro. They're the only nutrients that provide calories, which is to say, the only ones that provide fuel to the body. Vitamins, minerals, and water, they're critical to health, but they don't supply energy. Only macronutrients do. So, here's the fundamental math behind this. Carbohydrates provide about 4 calories for every gram you consume. Protein provides 4 calories for every gram you consume, and fat provides 9 calories per gram of food you consume. Notice something important there. Gram for gram, fat carries more than twice the caloric load of carbohydrates and protein. That doesn't make fat bad. As we'll see, dietary fat is absolutely essential, but it does explain why fat intake has such an oversized effect on our total daily calorie count. Now, let's get deeper into each one of the macronutrients. First, we'll dig into carbohydrates, or carbs first. Carbohydrate digestion begins the moment food enters your mouth. Salivary amylase, an enzyme in your saliva, immediately begins to break down the starches, which are carbs. Once food reaches your small intestine, pancreatic enzymes called amylase continues the process. And then additional enzymes all along the intestinal lining complete the job, reducing complex carbohydrates, which are actually just long branched out chains of glucose, break those down into individual glucose molecules. Those glucose molecules are absorbed directly into the bloodstream. Glucose then rises. Your pancreas then detects this and releases insulin. And insulin acts as the key that unlocks cells throughout your body, allowing glucose to enter and be used as energy, turning the fuel into energy. Now, let's look at the metabolic pathways for glucose. Once inside your cells, glucose enters a process called glycolysis, which is the breaking down of the glucose into a molecule called pyruvate. Pyruvate then enters the mitochondria, which is the cell's energy generator, where it fuels a process called the citric acid cycle and ultimately the electron transport chain producing ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which is the actual currency of cellular energy. You've probably heard of ATP. Now, I know this is science. It may get a bit much for most people, and you don't have to remember all the chemistry and the molecular names or pathways, but getting a sense what happens when we eat food gives us a better understanding of how and why to take personal charge of our diet and what we eat. Now, let's get back to glucose. Your body can also store glucose. Excess glucose is converted into glycogen, and it's stored in the liver and muscle tissue. Now, the liver will hold about 100 grams of glycogen in storage, or about 400 calories worth. Muscle can hold around 400 grams of glycogen across the entire body, or about 1,600 calories worth. When we use these stores and the stores are full and glucose keeps coming in, then the excess is next converted to fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. Translation, creating new fat. Okay? So eating too many carbs, if you eat them rapidly, results in fat accumulation in the body. This is the process that links excessive refined carbohydrate intake to fat gain. The source of our carbohydrate intake, it matters also, because not all carbs behave the same way. Simple carbs like sugar found in candy, sweetened beverages, white bread, and many of the processed foods that are out there, those are digested rapidly. Blood glucose will spike quickly, insulin surges in response, and the energy is either burned or stored. The rapid cycle of spike and crash can leave you hungry again within a few hours, which means if you eat high carbs or high sugar, you're going to get hungry quicker. Complex carbohydrates such as vegetables, legumes, whole grains, and most fruits are digested much more slowly because of the fiber content and the more complex molecular structure. Blood glucose rises gradually, insulin response is more moderate, and you will stay fuller longer. Fiber, though technically a carbohydrate, is not digestible by human enzymes and provides essentially zero usable calories. It benefits our bacteria in the gut, it slows glucose absorption, and it supports our health. There is one thing worth saying clearly. Your brain runs almost exclusively on glucose. Under normal dietary conditions, the brain consumes roughly 120 grams of glucose a day, representing about 20% of your total resting energy expenditure, despite the brain only weighing 2% of your total body weight. In states of prolonged fasting or very low carbohydrate intake, the liver can produce ketones from fat as an alternative fuel for the brain, but glucose remains the preferred and most efficient fuel for our brain and nerve tissue. This is one of the reasons that extreme carbohydrate restriction can produce cognitive fog, fatigue, irritability, particularly in the early stages of that type of diet. Your brain is telling you, hey, I want to eat what I'm used to. Next, we'll look at fat. For decades, dietary fat was portrayed as a villain. Eat fat, get fat, die young. The science has shifted substantially since then. And what we understand now is that fat is not only acceptable, it is biologically essential. There are things that fat does in your body that nothing else can do. Every single cell membrane in your body is built from phospholipids, which are fat molecules. Next, your sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, are created from cholesterol, which is a type of fat. The vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat soluble, which means they can only be absorbed in the presence of dietary fat. If you eat a fat-free diet and these critical vitamins, they're going to pass right on through you. Also, your nervous system is wrapped in a myelin sheath or a coating that is largely composed of fat. Adequate fat is essential for neurologic and brain function. Fat slows gastric emptying, meaning that food moves more slowly through your stomach. This promotes a feeling of fullness or satiety, and it also moderates post-meal blood glucose rises. So, how do we digest these fats? Well, fat digestion is more complex than carbohydrate digestion and happens primarily in the small intestine. Because fat is not water soluble, the body needs a special process to handle it. Bile, which is produced in the liver and stored in the gallbladder, emulsifies fat, which is basically breaking it down into large fat globules into smaller droplets, and then enzymes called lipases can break it down even from there. The resulting fatty acids and what are called monoglycerides, then they're absorbed into the intestinal lining, reassembled into larger fat particles called chylomicrons, and transported through our lymphatic system before entering the bloodstream. This is a deliberately slower process than carbohydrate absorption, which is why high-fat meals produce a more prolonged but gentler effect on energy and satiety. When the body needs energy from fat, either from dietary fat or from stored body fat, it uses a process called beta oxidation. Fatty acids are broken down inside the mitochondria in a stepwise fashion, which ends up producing acetyl-CoA, which then enters again the citric acid cycle, just as glucose metabolism does. Fat metabolism produces significantly more ATP per molecule than glucose metabolism, which kind of reflects the higher caloric content of 9 calories per gram. So you get more energy out of fat than you do out of glucose. The conversation about fat should never just be about quantity. The type of fat consumed is really more consequential than the amount. First, unsaturated fats, which are found in olive oil, avocado, nuts, and fatty fish, support cardiovascular health. Saturated fats, which are found in red meat, butter, and full dairy fat, are not inherently harmful, but if you consume too many of these, it is associated with elevated LDL or bad type cholesterol and cardiovascular risk in some individuals. And of course, trans fats, which are artificially produced through hydrogenation and found historically in many processed foods, they're generally harmful. But the good news is they've been largely removed from the food supply in the United States, and that occurred following regulatory action. So the fat out there is generally healthier. Omega-3 fatty acids, they're found in fatty fish, walnuts, flaxseed, and they deserve special mention. They are anti-inflammatory, support brain health, and play a role in cardiovascular protection. Now, most Americans are significantly under-consuming omega-3 fatty acids relative to omega-6s, and that imbalance also can have a negative metabolic effect and negative consequences. Finally, let's get to protein, where we began. What does protein actually do for us? Well, let's start with what a protein is. Proteins are the structural and functional workhorses of the human body. They're made up of amino acid chains, and those chains are used for the following purposes. First, they're used for building and repairing muscle tissue. Next, producing enzymes that drive every chemical reaction in your entire body. Also, they make our hormones, including insulin itself, and they support the immune function through antibody production. Proteins transport molecules through the bloodstream, such as hemoglobin, for example, which is a protein that carries oxygen to every cell of our body. They also provide structural integrity to skin, hair, nails, tendons, and ligaments through collagen and keratin. Protein is not primarily an energy source. Your body does not want to burn protein for fuel. It has a higher priority for it. When the body does burn protein for energy, it's a process called gluconeogenesis, and that's typically a sign of metabolic stress, including things like starvation or very low carbohydrate availability, or in extreme cases, muscle wasting. So, protein digestion begins in the stomach. The acid environment of the gastric juice, combined with an enzyme called pepsin, begins to break down protein peptides and kind of unfolds the protein structure. This is why stomach acid is so important. Stomach acid is not just for killing bacteria and pathogens, it's critical for protein digestion. In the small intestine, pancreatic proteases, including trypsin and chymotrypsin, continue breaking down protein into shorter peptide chains and then eventually amino acids, which are then absorbed into the bloodstream and transported to cells throughout the body. Importantly, protein digestion is the most metabolically expensive of the 3 macronutrients. The energy required to digest, absorb, and metabolize protein is known as its thermic effect, and that's approximately 20 to 30% of the protein calories consumed. Carbohydrates have a thermic effect of 5 to 10%, and fat is even lower at 0 to 3%. So what this means is that if you eat 100 calories worth of protein, your body will expend 20 to 30 calories just processing it. This is a real metabolic advantage and is part of the legitimate science behind protein's role in weight management. A good question is, how much protein does a person actually need? Well, the recommended dietary allowance for protein, or the minimum to prevent a deficiency, is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. For most clinical and functional purposes, moderate increases above this baseline are appropriate, particularly for individuals who are physically active, over the age of 65 or are actively losing weight to help preserve lean muscle mass. So here are some practical targets for most adults. If you're a sedentary adult, you need 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram per day. Active adults and recreational exercises need 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. Older adults over 65 need 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram per day to prevent muscle loss. Individuals in active weight loss also need 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day to preserve lean tissue. So for a 180-pound adult, or about 82 kilograms, a reasonable target for someone who's actively losing weight is roughly 130 grams of protein daily. And that's achievable. And it doesn't require you drinking protein shakes every meal, tracking macros obsessively, or eating chicken breasts for breakfast every day. Now, here's where the current high-protein trend gets it a bit wrong, and where we need to have an honest conversation about protein. So, the popular health culture has taken a legitimate nutritional principle that most Americans are under-consuming protein and amplified it into something that science does not support. The idea that dramatically high protein intake is inherently better and that you can essentially eat unlimited amounts of protein because it's the good nutrient, that's just not how our metabolism works. First, protein calories count. Protein carries 4 calories per gram, as we mentioned earlier. If you consume 250 or 300 grams of protein per day in a pursuit of a high protein diet while maintaining your caloric surplus, you will gain weight. The thermic advantage helps at the margins, but it does not override energy balance. Second, excess amino acids can't be stored as protein. Your body has no protein storage depot the way it does for glycogen with glucose and adipose tissue for fat. When you consume more amino acids than your body needs for its immediate structural and functional requirements, the excess is what's called deaminated. It means we strip the nitrogen away and then it's secreted through the kidneys as something called urea. And the remaining carbon skeleton of that amino acid is converted to either glucose or fat for storage. Excess protein becomes body fat. The source does not exempt it. Third, very high protein intake places increased demands on our kidneys. For healthy individuals with normal kidney function, this is generally manageable, but it is not without consequences over years or over decades, and it's a real consideration certainly for anyone with pre-existing kidney disease, diabetes with kidney irritation, or hypertension-related kidney changes. Fourth, and this is the dietary balance argument, the macronutrients compete for space in our diet. A diet that becomes extreme in protein almost by necessity becomes inadequate in carbohydrates or fats. And both of these macronutrients carry essential nutrients and functions that protein cannot replace. You cannot absorb fat-soluble vitamins without fat. You cannot sustain optimal brain function without adequate glucose. Protein cannot fill those roles. Everything we've covered today points toward the same conclusion. Your body evolved to run on a mixture of fuels. It has mechanisms to burn glucose, mechanisms to burn fat, and mechanisms to preserve protein for structural work. It can adapt to significant variation in macronutrient ratios, which is partly why so many different dietary approaches produce some results for some people. But some results for some people is not the same as optimal. There is no single macronutrient ratio that is correct for every person. There are, however, some well-established ranges that the body handles well. So, the scientific community advises the following ratios. Eat about 45 to 65% carbohydrates in your total calories a day, emphasizing complex and fiber-rich carbs. Fats should be 20 to 30% of your calories, emphasizing unsaturated sources and adequate omega-3s, and protein 15 to 25% of total calories, adjusted upward for weight loss, aging, and more aggressive exercise regimens. Now, I break from that and I have a personal and professional recommendation for my patients that I put on weight loss programs. It's slightly different. Again, I also take into account physical activity levels, age, and other medical conditions and medicines, and adjust these ratios accordingly. I recommend 33% of total calories from carbs, 33% of total calories from fat, and 33% of total calories from protein. On a 1,500 calorie daily diet, this would supply 500 calories from carbs, or about 125 grams, 500 calories from protein, or 125 grams, and 500 calories from fat, or 56 grams. Now, we're not going to hit these exact numbers daily, and that's not the goal. The goal is to balance the diet. And for most Americans, this balance of around a third of calories from each macronutrient will essentially increase their protein intake and reduce their carbohydrate intake. Within those ranges, your specific health situation, your metabolic, historic, your activity level, and the medications and interventions you're using to lose weight are all influencing where your personal ideal lies. And that's a conversation I have with each individual. So it's not a one-size-fits-all prescription in our diet. So what are the benefits of achieving this particular balance? When you maintain reasonable balance across the 3 macronutrients, number 1, your blood sugar remains more stable, which then reduces the insulin swings that drive hunger and fat storage. Your hormonal environment, which we did cover extensively in the Factor 4 video, is better supported. Also, you absorb the full spectrum of vitamins and minerals your food contains. Also, your gut microbiome, which requires diverse dietary fiber, functions much better. And your metabolism does not interpret restriction as a threat and then downregulate in response. Also, you're more likely to sustain the dietary pattern over months and years, which is the only timeline that produces lasting results, especially when it comes to this weight loss. Now, we've talked about the calories in each macronutrient. We've reviewed the fundamental driver of fat loss, which remains caloric deficit, consuming fewer calories than you expend. And there's no dietary strategy that circumvents this. What the composition of your diet does influence is how easy or difficult it is to maintain that deficit, how much lean muscle mass you preserve while losing fat, and how your metabolic rate responds to the process. I never simply hand a patient a calorie target and send them out the door, as happens in many doctors' offices. We look at each person's metabolic picture, their labs, the genetic tendencies, their response to specific medications and interventions, and then I build a strategy around their biology. The macronutrient conversation is a part of that. It never starts with things like eat more protein or avoid carbs or fat is good now. It starts with understanding what the body is doing with the food that they eat. So here's what I want you to take away from today's video. Carbohydrates are your body's primary and preferred fuel. Quality and fiber content matter far more than whether you eat them at all. Next, fats are essential, not optional. They build your hormones, protect your brain and neurons, and let you absorb critical vitamins. But the type of fat matters as much as the amount. And protein is critical for structure and function, and most Americans are generally under-consuming it, so eating more is a good thing. But more protein is not always better, and excess protein is metabolized as fuel and converted to fat just like any other macronutrient. Balance is not a compromise or a default recommendation for people who can't commit. It's the approach that best supports every single system metabolically in your body so it can function the way it needs to while you lose weight. So my goal is to have better understanding of your body and to make losing excess body fat and weight an experience for personal growth and improvement. I want to give you the education like today to understand why we're making the recommendations that we make when we talk to someone who needs to lose weight. I want to thank you for taking time to understand some of the science that will support lasting weight loss. That knowledge is part of what makes your results sustainable for life. I'm Dr. Greg Oliver, and when it comes to living a leaner, longer, and fulfilling life, health is one of the most important aspects. I'll see you in my next video. Please subscribe so you won't miss it, and have a great day.